Hi class, here's part 2 of our discussion on the nervous system. In part 2, we're going to focus primarily on the central nervous system. Even though it contains the fewest organs, containing the brain and spinal cord, our central nervous system, generally speaking, is going to be the most complicated because the brain and spinal cord are incredibly complex. The CNS is going to be made of both the brain and spinal cord tissue, and it'll be protected by a series of bones and membranes and fluids. The bones of the skull and vertebral column serve as rough impact protection for our CNS. We have a three-layered membrane known as the meninges, and this three-layer membrane is like gift wrapping or cellophane wrapping that wraps around the CNS to help protect it from the external environment. The three membranes of the meninges are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, and they all function together to protect the CNS. When a patient has meningitis, the meninge is inflamed. So the membrane around the brain or spinal cord becomes inflamed during meningitis. And then finally, we have the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is the cushion or the shock absorber of the central nervous system. Our brain and spinal cord float in a tub full of cerebral spinal fluid. As we look at the tissues of our brain and spinal cord, there are two broad categories of tissue, gray matter and white matter. Gray matter typically is going to have lots of unmyelinated cell bodies and non-myelinated nerve fibers in it, or non-myelinated axons. I want you to think of gray matter as thinking or processing matter. We also have white matter, which contains myelinated axons. White matter functions primarily to transmit information, where gray matter functions primarily to process the information. If we look at the spinal cord, the inferior or lower portion of our central nervous system, it starts at the base of the brain and will extend through the foramen magnum, out of the bottom of the skull, and through the vertebral column that's formed by the individual vertebrae. It travels through this vertebral column is formed by all the vertebral foramen of each individual vertebrae. Our spinal cord will both send and receive information to the brain, so it's going to provide communication between the brain and most of the body. We'll find that we also, in our spinal cord, will have some pre-processing of information. Every once in a while, it's where our body is exposed to a situation that's so stressful or so important that we need to make a decision before we can send the information to the brain. When we make a decision before we send the information to the brain, that's called a reflex. And this is typically going to be associated when bodily harm is at play. So let's say you're about to step on a sharp nail or something. Your reflex arcs in your spinal cord can help you pull your foot up before you put too much pressure on it. The gray matter within the spinal cord forms, well, what looks like a butterfly. We'll have some wings and a little abdomen in the center, and then the gray matter is surrounded by white matter to complete the picture. So here's our gray matter butterfly within the spinal column, surrounded by white matter. And then this spinal column is going to be nestled within a vertebral foramen and surrounded by a meninges. Here you can see some layers of the meninges. We have a dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater is not shown. In a human dissection, you can see that the spinal cord has many different roots coming off of it. We have roots leaving in the front, or the dorsal section. We have spinal cords leaving in the front or dorsal section. And then we also have leaving from the ventral or anterior section. So when I say dorsal, I really should say posterior. I always get dorsal and ventral mixed up. I'm terrible. I wish they would just say posterior and anterior. That would be much less confusing for me. So if we look at the brain itself, it has four big regions to it. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Let's look at those four big regions. The cerebrum is what we traditionally think of. It's the big wrinkly portion of the brain. And it's shown here as a light gray color. Our cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. We'll have a left and right hemisphere to our cerebrum. We also have a small portion that's inferior and posterior to the cerebrum, and this is going to be the cerebellum. We also have the brainstem, which starts right here and heads down to the spinal cord, and that is going to be where we have a lot of important life functions. And then we have a relay station in the center, and this integration center in the center of the station in the center of the brain is the diencephalon. Our diencephalon is made of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the epithalamus, aka the pineal gland. The brainstem is made of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum stands alone, and then the cerebrum also stands alone. It's worth emphasizing that the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum are connected by a bridge known as the corpus callosum. So if you think back to the comic strip I included on the first slide of this PowerPoint presentation, the corpus callosum, the great mediator, is what connects the left and right parts of our cerebrum. If we look at the cerebrum, it has the left and right hemispheres. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter on the surface of the cerebrum. There's also some very specific portions of the cerebrum we need to focus on. The primary motor and primary sensory areas are going to be located within the cortex. That primary motor area is located on this precentral gyrus on the frontal lobe, and the primary somatosensory area, or primary somatosensory cortex, is located on this postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. My bad. And we also are going to have some central white matter in the cerebrum. Think of that corpus callosum that I pointed out to you. The cerebrum has main lobes. These lobes of the cerebrum are named after the bones associated with the cerebrum, or associated with the lobe. So we have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and occipital lobe, which correspond to the frontal bone, temporal bone, parietal bone, and occipital bone. Our frontal lobe is going to have the primary motor area of our brain and lots of conscious thought processed there. Our temporal lobe is associated with auditory processing, sense of smell, and our speech production and processing. Our parietal lobe is going to be our primary somatosensory area and taste area. And when I say primary somatosensory, I mean our sense of touch, our sense of orientation, our temperature sense. And our occipital lobe is the area where we process most of the vision in our brain. So here in our our frontal lobe, we have that primary motor cortex. We're also going to have some cognition in the prefrontal area. In the occipital lobe in the back, we have the visual cortex. And the parietal lobe, we have the somatosensory area. And then in the temporal lobe, we have gustation. We have our auditory cortex. Well, if we look at that cerebral cortex, or that gray matter that makes the outside of the cerebrum, the primary motor area of it is and that frontal lobe is going to give us voluntary control of our skeletal muscles. And that primary somatosensory area is going to be associated with general senses of our skeletal muscles and skin. Association areas are going to have some pre-processing that occurs before they get to the primary processing area. And then processing centers are going to be distributed throughout the brain. These processing centers, generally speaking, are going to be associated with a specific function. For example, we have Broca's area right here, and then Wernicke's area, generally speaking, is going to be over here. Broca's area is involved with forming words. Wernicke's area is involved with determining how the words that we want to say. So if the understanding and formulating a response is done in Wernicke's area, Broca's area is physically moving our lips and tongue to make that response. So if you're working with a patient that can say words very clearly, but they're always gibberish, that patient has probably had a stroke in Wernicke's area. Their tongue and mouth are working just fine, but they can't process the speech to come up with an intelligible response. If you're working with a patient that says very clear or says very intelligent things, but they are always slurring their words, many times Wernicke's area is intact, but Broca's area may have had the stroke occur in it. As we look at the cerebrum of our brain, the cerebral cortex, or that outer gray matter edge, can be associated with different areas of the body. This right here is called a homunculus, or homunculi for plural, and this shows that for the primary motor area, we have disproportionately large amounts of our brain dedicated to our tongue, face, and hands, and disproportionately large amounts of our brain dedicated to our trunk and our feet and legs. This means we have lots of fine motor movement of our tongue, face, and hands, and poor gross motor movement of the trunk and appendages. And then for the sensory areas, we have disproportionately large amounts of sensory receptors on the lips and the face and the tongue and the genitals and the hands, and disproportionately few sensory receptors for the appendages, the trunk, and the internal organs. The next main part of the brain is the diencephalon, made of the hypothalamus, thalamus, and pineal gland, aka the epithalamus. The hypothalamus is an interface gland that helps to connect the endocrine and nervous systems together. It will help us by regulating hunger, sleep, thirst, body temperature, and water balances, and will control the pituitary gland that hangs on directly beneath it. The hypothalamus in newborn infants, generally speaking, is the last part of the brain to be developed before the kid is born. And if the kid is prematurely born, the hypothalamus hasn't developed the ability to regulate body temperature yet, and those prematurely born children oftentimes can be put in an incubator. If we look at the thalamus, which is directly superior to the hypothalamus, it's two masses of gray matter, one for each side of the cerebrum, and it's going to be a sensory relay station. There's going to be lots of motor fiber or nerve tracks, or I shouldn't say nerve tracks. There'll be lots of tracks within the thalamus relaying information to different parts of the brain. Our pineal gland, or epithalamus, is going to help regulate our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian rhythms, by secreting melatonin to make us feel sleepy. Here is that thalamus. Here's the epithalamus. There's the hypothalamus. And directly beneath the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. We'll focus mostly on the pituitary gland with our discussion of the endocrine system. Moving on, we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this portion that hangs down low in the posterior and inferior region of the brain. Our cerebellum is going to help us with integrating sensory input from many different parts of our body, and also with our sense of location, our sense of proprioception, how we know where our body is in space. Our cerebellum will aid us with proper posture and help us to have smooth voluntary movements. Excuse me. If a patient has had a stroke in their cerebellum, they may have the inability to maintain the posture, or they may twitch and have tremors whenever they try to move. But if they stop trying to move and the tremors go away, that'll be your big clue that the cerebellum is damaged. If the tremors do not go away when the patient stops trying to move, that's an indication that the damage was in a different part of the brain, known as the basal nuclei, as opposed to the cerebellum. Our cerebellum also aids us with muscle memory, or learning new motor skills. If we look at our brain stem, which is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, starting at the top of the midbrain, our midbrain will relay information from the spinal cord or cerebellum to the rest of the cerebrum. So it's really a crossroads in our brain. A stroke to the midbrain is fatal. Actually, just generally speaking, strokes to the brain stem are fatal. If a patient has damage to their brain stem, they're dead. They typically do not live through that. The pons is a big gap in the brain, or big bulge in the brainstem that is directly anterior to the cerebellum. Our pons will help to regulate our respiratory rate and our head movements. The medulla oblongata also aids us with regulating our respiratory rate and also regulates heartbeat and blood pressure. And I should also mention that these parts of the brain are also going to help us, just generally speaking, maintain homeostasis in our body. So when we think of the brainstem, I want you to think of maintaining homeostasis. And if we have damage to our brainstem, we lose the ability to maintain homeostasis and very quickly will die. Within the brainstem, we have the reticular formation. This reticular formation travels through the main three components, the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, to help regulate alertness in our bodies. So this reticular formation will travel up in lavender or purple, and travels all the way through the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. And then will radiate information to the cerebral cortex. So, class, concept check. Which of the following structures is incorrectly matched with their functions? Does the frontal lobe aid us with our sense of smell? Does the occipital lobe aid us with our sense of function? Parietal lobe with general senses? Or the temporal lobe with our sense of hearing? Go ahead and pause the video and get me an answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, class, the correct answer is A, frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe is primarily associated with voluntary motor movements and higher thought processes. It is not associated with our sense of smell. Also in our brain, or our as part of our central nervous system, we have the limbic system. This limbic system is going to aid us with our primitive emotions. Fear, pleasure, centers are all associated with the limbic system and will influence our higher thought or reasoning functions. Sometimes I've heard the limbic system summarized as sleep, sex, and satisfaction, or satiation, in that it helps you with regulating your sense of hunger, your sense of sleep, and your drive to have sex, or your libido. The limbic system, generally speaking, is associated with very strong emotional reactions. Within our limbic system, these very strong emotional reactions can sometimes override our higher brain centers. This would be somebody who has, for example, temporary insanity due to extreme anger. And within our limbic system, there are two very specific structures I want to highlight. We have the amygdala. The amygdala is associated with emotional overtones of our body. And yes, that is going to remain that vague because it's not very well understood. The hippocampus is another structure of the limbic system that's very important for taking short-term memories and conveying those short-term memories and converting them into long-term memories, particularly short semantic information. So here we can see our limbic system. Our limbic system is more a grouping of function than a grouping of structures. So the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract, which conveys our sense of smell, is associated with our limbic system and will directly connect to the amygdala and the hippocampus, and will help us with regulating our emotional and short-term memory, emotional responses, and taking those short-term memories and converting them to long-term memories. So we'll have different kinds of memory form due to our limbic system functions. We can have learning occur, for example, and learning specifically is committing something to memory and then being able to recall that memory. So to use the information you've stored in your brain. If you can use the information, you have learned it. Just putting the information in your brain is called memory. We have short-term memory. Short-term memory will only last for a few minutes, and then long-term memory is going to last for days, weeks, or years. And there's different kinds of long-term memory. We can have episodic memory. Episodic memory focuses on people, places, emotions, and then we have semantic memories. Those are going to focus on cold, hard, objective facts, numbers and words, so to speak. So if you're somebody who can always remember a face but never remember the name, you have great episodic memory, poor semantic memory. If you're somebody who still remembers the phone number of your first boyfriend or first girlfriend, but you can't remember what they look like, you might have great semantic memory, but terrible episodic memory. We also have scale memory or motor memory. This is going to be separate from the hippocampus, and it's going to be primarily associated with the cerebellum. We also have language learning, and this language is going to depend on semantic memory and is going to be localized in different regions of the brain. For example, when you read something, seeing the word is going to involve using the occipital cortex, or the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and then understanding the word that you're listening to is going to be associated with the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe and Wernicke's area, and then choosing how to move and form your mouth and lips and to formulate a response is done in Broca's area, and then finally you will actually send the signal to your mouth and lips to move, and that's done from the primary motor cortex. So by reading and listening to the information, you use the occipital and temporal lobes, then you process it in Wernicke's area, form your response in Broca's area, and send the response from the primary motor cortex. So, class, concept check. Which of the following structures helps to convert short-term to long-term memories? Is it the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, or the olfactory bulb? Go ahead and rewind the video to get me an answer. If you need to check your notes, textbook, go ahead. That's totally fine. Pause the video right now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is B, hippocampus. The hippocampus aids with converting short-term to long-term memories. And that's all we have for our recording on the central nervous system. This recording has been part 2 of 3. If you have any questions for me about this content, please feel free to post in the class discussion board, or you can shoot me an email or swing by my office when you're on campus. Happy studies!